I teach, but not in a regular capacity. But last year, and I'm going to do a second round this year, I teach at the Städteschule in Frankfurt. But I'm a visiting professor, so it probably won't be beyond this year. This will be the second and last year.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's something I actually almost had on my list of questions. I had a strong sense from your work that you could be an educator of sorts.
I like teaching very much. I think also in large part because I didn't go to art school or to film school. It's been a real pleasure being in the schools. So in this case, as an instructor or as an educator, as a way of sort of talking about what it is that we do and how we do it. And it's also very draining because I think it means being available to sharing the practices of many different artistic voices. And that requires a true, you have to be very available and very open. And that's sometimes difficult to combine with certain, I would say, temporalities of the work of making films. I think when you're editing or when you're shooting or even when you're writing, these tend to be moments of extended concentration that are not necessarily compatible with the regularity of being an educator. But whenever possible, and it has been the case often in the course of the past 2 decades, I do like to teach in art, mostly in art schools, to be honest with you, more so than in film schools.
Mm-hmm. But how did you find art schools as someone who doesn't come from art education?
I think that they vary greatly in the feeling that one has when you spend time there. But I frequently find art schools to be really amazing places of erudition, of openness to cross-disciplinary perspectives. I find that there's a for the most part, there's a really tremendous amount of curiosity among the students and the faculty, of course, and also just people who look at things from a very transversal way. You know, they watch films, they watch documentaries, they read, philosophy. So I think that I find that the conversations are often wonderful.
I find myself to have a very similar kind of experience because being an architect, it is a field slightly closer to, let's say, than maybe political science, which is the field that you come from, into the art. So I share exactly those ideas about art education, and over the years I've also engaged with art education, but there are certain difficulties as well within art education, namely something that I've noticed, and I don't know whether you share that view, and maybe there is something, I guess, good in that, is sometimes sort of tendency to not do. I think many fields revolve around productivity, and I think maybe art education, at least what I've experienced, maybe has an interesting relationship with productivity. And I don't know how you find that, and actually being a very productive artist yourself.
I mean, what I will say is that I have at times been surprised by the ruts, the sort of the blank patches or the unproductive times that some of the students seem to go through. But also, having not gone to art school, it's not so much that I don't know what it's like. I mean, now that I've taught, on and off for almost 20 years in various art schools, 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, a semester here, a semester there, I know what it's like inside an art school, but what I do not know is what it's like to spend 5 years of your life in an art school. And so I do not have a relatable understanding of what it means to be in school and to be puzzled, to not have not be able to produce, to be questioning so much that nothing comes out of the studio. So I have sometimes felt that there's something of a blockage, or there's something that's not emerging from the studio. And this has always puzzled me. I find, because I've had many problems as an artist, but I have never been confronted with this, with the accursed dry spell. I'm going to knock on wood because I hope I'm not cursing myself by saying it. But I've never had difficulty producing work. Maybe the work's not any good, but I've always had things that I wanted to make, always. And perhaps in school, I think something that seems to happen is that students or young artists confronted with a number of questions that translate into doubts, that translate into, in French we have a good word, it's the word empêchement, which is literally something that forbids you from, something that prevents you from moving forward. And the things that can prevent you from can have many reasons. One is that, you start reading a lot of critical theory, or you start reading a lot of sort of cultural criticism, or various forms of sort of intellectual discourse, and this can start causing you to doubt about the relevance or the possibility of, and then gradually it becomes harder to make. I've sometimes noticed that in students that have multiple diplomas in multiple fields in multiple areas and have spent many years in different kinds of schools, sometimes are confronted with this difficulty to make because they know too much. And maybe one of the advantages of being self-taught is that you don't know too much. So you don't know the things that might prevent you from working. And maybe if you found out about these things earlier, it would be harder to work. Because working with the knowledge of what's been made before is helpful to some extent, but it's also can also be a great inhibitor. So there's a certain amount of ignorance that I think is precious. I mean, one of the things I usually tell students when I'm in the classroom is not to over research something that they're interested in other words, because there might be a lot that they will learn, but there's also a lot that they will no longer feel authorized doing, and this can be an inhibition, create an inhibition.
I share that, and I actually try to practice that as well in the field of architecture, which, because it's also a profession, it really requires you to present yourself as a very informed and competent person. So sometimes there is a real suggestion that you must know everything.
Right. And at the same time, I think erudition is a wonderful attribute. I mean, but it's also possibly more important to be very knowledgeable about fields that are separate from specifically, or so perhaps in architecture, being well informed about ethnography and art history might be possibly more useful than to be encyclopedic about every building ever built by every great master in the field, or something like that.
And so with that insight, what do you think then maybe the purpose of art education is or should be?
Well, it's a very interesting question, especially when you sort of know with some certainty that most of the students that you have in the classroom will not become artists for various reasons. So then the question is, what are you doing in the classroom if not helping people become ostensibly what the school is meant to train them into? I think once you give up on the idea that you are helping them become artists, once you abandon this completely, then it really becomes about developing a critical mind, a mind that thinks about the relationship between a question and a form, and that this applies to many things. I mean, I find it very interesting that a lot of very good graphic designers come from art school, for example, or that there's a number of what we could so-called applied arts that are learned or that are sort of where that come from people who actually worked inside of the art school space, and then they became sort of problem solvers in other fields, which I find to be fascinating. So I think what we're doing in the studio, in the discussion or in the critique, is learning sort of how to discuss formal questions, conceptual questions, political questions, and how to find a space, a place of contact between ideas and forms, which applies to so many other things then later in life.
Mm. Maybe actually on your own case, we could talk about at what point did you become an artist? Or at what point did you just comfortably say, I'm an artist? Because presumably this has been a kind of seamless transition, yet there must have been a point where you actually felt comfortable.
I think I tried to postpone this problem as much as possible because it's a complicated step to make. It's loaded with connotations and painful psychological dimensions. I think in my case, because there was a lot of serendipity, I didn't specifically set up to become an artist. In other words, going to art school was not even remotely, or becoming an artist and therefore going to art school to prepare for that wasn't remotely in my consciousness at any point growing up. I didn't even take art classes in high school I don't know how to draw. This was never part of my sort of imagining a future for myself. I didn't even take art history classes in university, to be candid. I did go to museums and I did like to see exhibitions. I think I thought about film a lot more. I considered at some point or another whether I should apply to a film school, but I very quickly evacuated that for two reasons that are very conventional and very classical. One is that I was convinced I wouldn't get into the film school in France, the FIMIS, like the very sort of famous, well-known public film school. I was just convinced I would never even make it through the exam, so why bother? And also because I come from, the kind of family where you learn how to learn a trade where you can make a living. And so that's a very sort of, my grandfather, who I loved greatly, used to always say, you can do whatever you want with your life, but it has to have a name. You have to be able to say, I am a X. Doesn't matter what X is. I think what he meant by that, even though artist is a name, he mostly meant, I think, a word that people understand what you do, and that comes with the paycheck at the end of the month, or at least some form of remuneration. So what happened with me is that I was interested in the world, and I was interested in thinking about events, about current events initially, and then sort of the political histories and social movements and political dynamics. And so on the one hand, that drew me towards what I did study at university, which was political science. And then it also sort of nourished a side activity that I've always had, which was photography. I mean, even when I was an adolescent, I built a dark room in my bathroom, and I learned how to process film, and I really loved this, the emergence of the image in the chemistry. I don't think that any of the things I photographed for 10 years doing this were at all interesting, or not. There's no works there that were really even that would be worth looking back at today and finding remotely interesting. I think I was really interested in the technique of it. But this later on became the venue, something that I turned to because it had to do with being in the world. It had to do with trying to find a form to understand the reality that unfolds in the world. And so when I became disillusioned with the work of the social sciences and looked for a different activity, I think I came back to photography in a very strong way because it allowed me to be in the world, and it kind of answered this question of what form can you produce that reflects the problems of the real? And so for a long time, it was easy to not answer this question of, am I an artist? I didn't have to say that. I could say I'm a photographer, which is probably, it carries a lot less baggage. And it's a lot simpler, I think, to just sort of be a self-taught photographer and to say I'm a photographer. Also because for a long time, I made a living on assignments. I photographed architecture for years. I was an architecture photographer. And that was a very simple task, beautiful task, actually, at the service of the architectural firm or at the service of a publication, taking the time, walking around buildings in urban settings and trying to find a way to create a form that reflects this reality. And then gradually, as I started doing exhibitions and then started doing video work, then I was showing inside of art galleries. And so at some point, it felt like I could start saying that I'm an artist because I make a living by selling things that are up for sale in an art gallery and also sometimes showing in museums. But I think it's a lot simpler to arrive in this place in this sort of serendipitous manner that I did than being 19 or 16 or 25 and saying, I want to become an artist and going to art school and learning the history of trajectories of other artists and then trying to sort of find a place to call your own within this pantheon of great artists. And I think that's a lot more, it's much more difficult. And I'm aware of this difficulty when I teach because I see young artists working through these questions that I didn't have to work through. At some point, I realized that I was doing this. And the economy in which I worked was sort of validating it. And therefore, the conversations I was having with people like you were a time when suddenly I could say, yes, I guess I'm an artist.
Mm. There are two questions, but I guess I can't ask them at the same time. So I'll just, they're quite different. So firstly, it's almost like a psychological question. There must have still been a thread of some kind of peculiarity of your character that comes from that sort of teenager through the photographer, through the political scientist into this artist.
It's hard to be interested. I think in some way I'm the worst. I have the worst vantage point to understand the itinerary. You know what I mean? I think, and I mean this in a very, I think that's true of everybody. Everybody could say it's difficult to reflect on your trajectory from your own perspective. But in my case, because of the nature of the work I've produced over the past few years, which is very heterogeneous, very different, there's no sort of aesthetic, there's no obvious and evident visual continuity. I'm not interested in I've never really been interested in aesthetic continuity. All of the works I produce are very much problem specific. In other words, I'm interested in something. I learn whatever medium is most relevant to fabricate a form around this preoccupation. And so the forms don't necessarily look like each other. The medium, the materials used, the formal considerations can be very, very different from film to film or from exhibition to exhibition. Of course, I think that this is all held together in a very coherent way by, how I think about the world and how I think about creating forms that relate, that are, that resist too quick a reading, that leaves space for the spectator to work through things for herself or for himself, and then of course over time, for somebody who will want to familiarize themselves with the larger body of work, then the correlations are quite clear. But it's very different than somebody who's working through. It's very different from the trajectory of somebody who's working through questions relating to painting or figuration over time, evolving their brushstroke, evolving their color palette, and you sort of have all of these canvases that you can look at in chronological order and see the evolution of of formal considerations in painting. So it's hard to, I mean, I think it's hard to really be able to say, this is what, these are the links between my past and my present. Outside of some very, very general observations, which is that I've always been interested in the world. I've always had a keen interest in political questions and political questions that also become personal questions. How do we respond to situations? How do we implicate ourselves in political or social situations? And there is obviously a relationship between the works that I've made and these questions. There's very little directly autobiographical material in my work. I think the project I'm working on now that has something to do with my mother and telekinesis and the history of parapsychology is the first time that my work has anything to do with something specifically autobiographical. And so I guess it's a very long-winded answer to your question. The political considerations and were already very present in my youth, and then you could also look back and to say, if you look at my family on the Baudelaire side of the family, there's a long lineage of an alternance between soldiers and painters, and there have been a number through the generations. There have been painters whose children were soldiers, whose children were painters, whose children were soldiers who did paint over the weekend or wanted to be painters, but instead became soldiers. So you could say that I'm just lucky I didn't become a soldier.
Yes, yeah. I was just gonna say that. Maybe you were supposed to, but then,
Well, I hope my son will not become a soldier, which is why I put.
You might also hope that.
Before.
You might also hope that he won't become a painter. So.
Right. We joke with my partner that he'll, as all sons and daughters of artists, he'll probably become an accountant or something very sort of,
straightforward. But I think then my second question was about your interest in history. You said that you didn't have the kind of art history education. You never sat in an art history class. When I speak to artists, I often find it interesting, actually, that they struggle with art history or history in general, and they somehow, maybe they can speak about a certain distant history, but then their own influences. There is this whole question of artists acknowledging their influence. There is a wonderful book by, I think, Harold Bloom, The Anxiety of Influence, I think. So I don't feel you have that anxiety in a way. And I think that's also manifested through your interest, acknowledging the interest in history and art history. So I just maybe wonder how has that sort of interest been framed over the years, and perhaps where does it sit now?
I mean, I think that having been absolutely oblivious to art history into my mid-20s, I entered, or my interest in art history emerged very much as a continuation of my interest in history, period. In other words, I think I've always been interested in history from a very young age. The narratives of history are something that I'm very naturally interested in, and I think also that I understand and have understood from a very, very young age. In other words, the way histories can be told is a language that has always felt extremely natural to me, in the sense that I understand the series of consequences or the sequence of events that constitute a historical narrative, regardless of what this narrative is. When I delve into it, I typically feel like I understand the sequence of events, how one thing has led to another thing. And I've always found that this flow is phenomenally interesting. And so I think when I encountered art history, I literally simply continued to have the same interest in an evolution, in a chronological evolution of forms, that is very much about external influences, ethnographic, political, social currents. And I've always looked at art history in parallel to political history. And I think I'm interested in the emergence of abstraction as it maps to the historical events of the world at the same time, or Viennese actionism or socialist realism. I mean, these moments in the history of art, in my mind, was never dissociated from the chronology of political events happening in these other forms of historical narratives. In terms of my own practice, I could certainly talk about practices that triggered a desire to make forms that respond to similar problems or similar questions. So I would say that rather than influences, I would speak more about artists whose trajectories created a desire for me, So when I discovered the films of Jean-Luc Godard early on, and then his essay, or the narrative forms of Jean-Luc Godard and related to them early on, I was struck by their freedom. And when I discovered the essay films, or the sort of the later work, I was struck by how relevant they were to somebody like me who was thinking about political questions that were present in Godard's mind when he was making certain films, and finding that this formal solution was brilliant, even though I'd always thought about this particular moment in history from the perspective of, say, as a social scientist. I suddenly see Godard's form, and I realize how free and liberating it is, because it addresses similar questions or problems, but it sheds light on so many other things, and it makes connections in so many multiple ways. And I think, looking at this from the perspective of a social scientist who's always been interested in the relationship between different theoretical possibilities or theoretical lenses for looking at the real, suddenly this is like a kaleidoscopic vision, where the lenses are providing so many new forms while looking at the same question. So I would say that it wasn't necessarily the question of being influenced by, but watching something that creates the desire for. So when I discover Chris Marker's Sans Soleil, I start seeing for the first time the possibility of a film can be this kind of thing, and then it speaks to me very, very much. Or coming from photography and being interested in the landscape, discovering the work of Chantal Akerman, traveling east in a car with a 16mm camera on a trajectory that is both somewhat biographical, because her family comes from the East and she's searching for something that's no longer there. She's also moving east as the East is transforming and collapsing to some extent, or rather, living yet another transformation. And that there is, opening the window of the car and filming these slow trajectories in Moscow of people waiting in the snow for a bus, was incredibly exciting for me, because I had, I've been going east since I've been an adolescent, as a young Russian student, and an observer of the transformation of the East. And I had been thinking about the East from the perspective of a political scientist, and suddenly I see what it means to look through the window of a car at people waiting for a bus in Moscow in this evening light, and feeling very emotionally the political possibilities, the historical possibilities of this form of narrative is very empowering. And this authorized so many possibilities for me.
You just made me think of Jean-Luc Godard's Le Mépris, which is formally very refined and precise. Yet, interestingly, it also has that kind of historic referentiality. It talks about Fritz Lang making a film. So in its kind of refined quality and playfulness with the medium, he's also making a commentary on the history of the medium. There is something about plugging yourself into the history or into the moment in history.
Well, plugging yourself into the moment of history, I think you could, I mean, or plugging yourself into several moments of history, because sometimes what it is meant is looking at being concerned about the present, making a film about the past that has possible ramifications towards a future. And then suddenly it's like being, in a time machine, looking at history as this like flow and trying to interact with multiple parts of this flow. Do you know what I mean? Especially because I've looked back a lot at the 60s and 70s and the sort of revolutionary movements of that era, but I never looked back at them from the perspective of a historian. I was interested in these periods of history because of what they tell us about today and how they can inform us about tomorrow. So it's an interest in history that is very much about figuring out how I can think about the future. Because this particular moment in the history of the left or of the feels that it is full of teachings for the difficulties of the present. That's how I arrived to this period maybe 10 years ago. So it's about being plugged into, but where are you plugging into and why are you plugging into this moment in the flow? You know what I mean?
Yes. I wonder if you've ever experienced history on your own skin.
You mean in terms of the grand narratives? I mean, are you speaking as somebody from the former Yugoslavia who has sort of been in the front rows of an enormous historical transformation? No, I have not lived a specifically sort of structural transformation the way you have. I have felt, personally, the being involved in large transformations that had something to do with the histories I inherited from my grandparents who had transformative experiences during the Second World War, the occupation, deportation, and a number of sort of like, grand historical moments. And they handed down these narratives to me, and I know that these were formative experiences, but not things that I personally experienced. I think that anybody of our generation, regardless of where they grew up or where they lived, have been witnesses to moments of historical transformation. Specifically, I would say 9/11 is an inflection point. September 11, 2001 is a critical inflection point in in the grand narrative of history. There's a before and there's an after, and it is an absolute transformation of a scale similar to things that happened in the middle of the 20th century. If you look at, especially if you consider the devastation of the political situations unraveling today and how they relate to this particular moment. And maybe you should even go back a little bit earlier to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. In my lifetime, having been, in an adjacent country at the moment and being exactly 18 at the moment of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, it is a historical moment that I felt that I witnessed. And living in New York City on September 11th and watching the World Trade Centers collapse in front of my eyes and not on a television screen. In both instances, I can say very honestly that I understood immediately that there would be an after and that the world was never going to be the same. I wouldn't have been able to predict what this meant, but I certainly understood that everything would change. And these days, because I imagine it's the same with you or the people around you, is that we are having a number of conversations these days about how we are traversing one of the darkest periods of our entire lifetimes. That there are so many reasons to be immensely pessimistic about the world, about where things are heading. In Europe, every couple of months, a new democracy is democratically voting in a fascist party into power, freely choosing fascist narratives at the ballot box. And we grew up in an age where democracy was triumphant, liberal democracy was triumphant, growing up in the 90s after having studied political science at a time when Francis Fukuyama was able to publish the thesis that history had ended. It's an enormous transformation to this particular moment. The 90s was a moment of endless hope, endless optimism. We had defeated apartheid. I remember traveling to Ramallah and Jericho in the mid-90s without going through a checkpoint between Tel Aviv and Ramallah, and being optimistic about the post-Oslo situation in Israel-Palestine. Of course, today you could say that the worm was already in the fruit, as we say in French. That that there was already structurally the nothing was solved, but there was superficial reasons to be very optimistic about everything in the world in the late 90s. And on September 11th, something broke, and the trajectories changed. But significantly, I often say that when asked, when did you decide to be an artist? The answer is on the morning of September 11th, specifically on the rooftop of my building, specifically with a camera around my neck, because I had gone to drop off laundry in the morning on the way to Manhattan, where I had a job. And I stopped at the laundromat, and there was a television, and there was a news report, and there was smoke emerging from one of the towers, and the TV said that the subways were no longer running underneath from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And so instead of going to work, I went back home, and when I arrived home, I saw that my roommate was not in the apartment, and his camera equipment was scattered around the living room. So I thought he must have gone to the roof to take a picture of the World Trade Center. So I took my cameras and I also went up to the roof, and then we stayed there all morning, and we both planes had already hit, but the towers were still both standing, and then one and then the other collapsed. And I took 2 pictures that morning. I took one after the collapse of the first tower, at this completely astonishing vision of the twin towers being only one tower. And then I took another picture, which is irrelevant. It's just a big cloud of the second tower, when the second tower was collapsing, but before anything was visible. So none of these, neither of these pictures are significant in any way. I understood while making them that tens of thousands of pictures that were identical to mine were being taken in simultaneity, and that it was because this was a 6x7 film camera. Film was somewhat expensive to process, and I knew that it was senseless to make any pictures that morning. And so I thought, this is interesting. At this time I was transitioning to become a photographer. I had been a political scientist, and yet I wasn't making any pictures that morning because I knew that none of them mattered. There was no picture that I could take that day from such a close vantage point that had any significance whatsoever. So why even take the picture? I have friends who rushed to the towers, took pictures, sometimes amazing pictures of the event as it unfolded, took hundreds of pictures. I didn't. I took 2 pictures. And I think that that's when I understood that I had to think of another form to sort of reflect upon the events of that day that were absolutely transformative. And I think that that's how that is when the journey really began to looking for other forms that led me to do exhibitions, films, other forms that I felt gave me possibilities of developing ideas about complex issues like this word terrorism, or these complex sort of ruptures or these tremendously painful moments that we were going to enter, and that I wanted to talk about that. And I didn't feel like the camera was going to help me at all. That the still camera was not going to help me at all. So I guess, again, it's a long answer to your question. I think these were moments when I felt like, yes, my body was subjected to the flow of history. On these occasions, I did feel this way.
In that, there is something interesting, or in that there is something formative about both the question of medium, but also the question of subject, and I guess how you approach the subject. If we talk about the medium, I think it's interesting how the medium is also a reflection of the moment in history. So the medium is also something that's evolving. And you were acutely aware that, I guess, of the medium of television in perhaps 2001. And that's changed and transformed. And maybe that's why you only took 2 photographs. But then the second is this maybe urge to investigate. So many artists nowadays work within research and I guess let's just call it research. You don't necessarily talk too much about research as a form of practice, but perhaps it is in some way a form of practice. And then how does that tie to the medium?
Well, I think I don't talk about research because I feel like, either all art is research, because trying to imagine a new form is fundamentally akin to what happens in the process of research, whether it's scientific research or archival research, or trying to invent something, you're doing research. So all art is research. I'm also a little bit wary about this idea of like research-based art, because I think although there are some artists who conduct serious research in order to produce artworks, there's also a tremendous number of artists who are not conducting, I think, very serious or very interesting research, but are sort of holding on to this term, and I find it sort of a little bit of a abuse of language. Because coming from social sciences, I do have a tremendous respect for the very serious work of research, in the tradition of academia, in the tradition of laboratory or social scientific research. So I don't like to use the word too lightly as a way to sort of lend credibility to an artistic practice. I don't think it's relevant either. You don't need to have the credibility of research to make interesting art. I think for me, but it's very much the case for pretty much any artist, it's about finding the form that accommodates the mess, to borrow from Samuel Beckett's definition of the work of the artist. So it's finding a form to accommodate the mess means looking, researching at this mess and then trying to find a form. These are the words that Beckett's use, and I find these are beautiful words. The word, finding means that it's somewhere there. You just have to locate it, and the word mess is really the most wonderful word in this citation from Beckett, because it is a mess. The world is a mess. Our place in the world is just a mess. It is all terribly messy and disorganized and hurtful, and so with this idea that the role of the artist is to find a form to accommodate it. Accommodate is an amazing word. He doesn't say the role of the artist is to represent the mess or to organize the mess or to illustrate the mess. No. He says the role of the artist is to find a form to accommodate it, to include within it, to live with it. This is what we do.
And so, okay, so you would say that, let's say, your interest in moments in history, or I'd say maybe political situations, is a piece of mess that you are trying to accommodate. I'm just thinking of your work, your letters to British members of Parliament in the House of Lords.
Right. So certainly, right. So that's a typical case of something we consider a mess. Brexit's a mess. Parliament, it's a public referendum that finds a democratic process that produces an outcome which, in all likelihood, is a terrible outcome for everybody involved. I mean, I hope this is not presumptuous to say this, with all respect to people who voted for Brexit. I think in general, parliamentary democracy today in the West often produces results that are, to use like a political science terminology, suboptimal for everybody involved. In other words, for a long time, there was this idea that democracy was a system that produces good results in a liberal sense, for the collective well-being of the people involved. There's a lot of economists who've theorized over the years that, participatory democracy also produces good outcomes economically. There's a whole bunch of sort of like extremely Western-oriented and ideologically sort of, questionable theory that says that parliamentary democracies produces better economic results and produces growth, and it does this, that, and the other. Of course, it depends who you have in mind when you talk about growth and who's benefiting from this, et cetera, et cetera. But I think today, almost 30 years after my studies in political science, I think it would be interesting to look at how completely fucked up parliamentary democracy has become and how it has produced extraordinarily suboptimal results, and how it is currently producing things that are completely undemocratic in the United States. I mean, imagine if Donald Trump gets reelected, which everybody seems to think of as a foregone conclusion, you actually have what is, touted as, the exemplary democracy of our era, supposedly, producing this horrendously undemocratic, monstrous phenomenon. And this is what we built. This is the world we built. Having draped ourselves in all of these theories of sort of political and economic superiority, we are creating monsters. And so, yes, this is a mess. This is a mess. And I think that this is a really interesting mess to apply the lens of art to. And then, the mess has been civil war in Georgia that has produced Abkhazia and has been
that was another example I was going to use.
A subject of preoccupation for me for 23 years since my first trip to Abkhazia, and it's generated a number of different works. Why? Not because of the specificities of Abkhazia or Georgia or the Caucasus, but because it's a place that it's a mess that brings up so many fascinating questions about the fiction of nationhood. You know, this collective narrative that we've generated that we call the nation and nationalism. The question of ethnic coexistence, the question of the extinction of languages, the question of civil war is just a manifestation of these questions. So it's my interest in Abkhazia hasn't simply been a regional preoccupation. It's a way of thinking what it means to say I am British or I am French. We forget that these notions are extremely recent in the history of mankind, that the nation state is an extraordinarily recent construct, that it is a construct. And today it's an axiomatic element of our language. You know, we are fearful of the invasion of Mexicans who, because they are of another nation or they are of another color or they are of a, and so these narratives that have become sort of civilizational flashpoints and that are such an enormous part of the media landscape today, fabricating these democratic processes towards populist fascism. That's the mess that was of interest to me when I started going to Abkhazia, because it's like a laboratory case. It's like looking at a small situation that has elements of absurdity to it that are very much on the surface, but that actually tell us so much about the world in general that we live in today. And so, similar reasons why I've been interested for so many years about the Palestinian struggle or about this question of terrorism. All of these are very messy situations, but they are messy and tremendously significant or tremendously relevant to the way in which we've organized our collective lives. And recently I've started thinking about this in other terms, in terms that are a little bit more general, like thinking about the concept of what Roland Barthes called vivre ensemble, to live together. And there's really, this would be the positive way of looking at these questions. Under what conditions can we live together? What are the cultural questions or psychological or philosophical constructs that help us live together at a time when it has become increasingly clear that we don't live together very well? So I think I like this word mess from Beckett because it's a very modest way of talking about these realities that we sometimes have to apply much bigger words for. But really what it is just a mess.
I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Adam Curtis, but he has a particular talent in kind of creating bigger mess out of the mess. He goes on a tangent. He starts with one thing and ends up in another, and you're sort of left there thinking, how did we get where we did? But I think what you do is something very different if we are to compare your work to the work of Adam Curtis. Thinking, let's say, of your film where you are talking to the Abkhazian foreign minister, I think there is a really powerful sentence there where he says, war is so easy, actually, and the objectives are clear.
Right.
It's really the mess is in what's after. And we have spoken about the medium kind of emerging almost, revealing itself through the theme, through the subject. Mm-hmm. But how do you identify that thing through which the story reveals itself?
Well, hopefully the form is also a mess, right? In other words, hopefully the form is not resolved in any way that makes any of this seem either simple or that it isn't about, leaving all this space for the viewer to exist within the confines of the work, to think through some of these things. push around, find a place for themselves. So I think what you've just said is the work. The work is looking at something and then struggling to find materials that you can make something with. What is that material? Is it a sound? Is it a letter? Is it a series of images? Is it a space? Is it something performative? What is the material that you work with? And then assembling this material, putting it into a space for an exhibition, for example, or working, as it were, in the editing room to assemble images and sounds and temporality and perspectives to create something very complex, which a film always is, as a place that leaves room for the viewers to find a place for themselves inside of this mess. That's what takes time. That's what we do. So there's something, that is linked to so many other art forms. It's like it feels like architecture sometimes, or like building, trying to test out a volume and see how you feel inside of it. The most important part of all of this is the collaborative nature of it. In other words, these are not solitary journeys. They have very much to do with working with people who have very specific experiences and very specific abilities, working with Claire Maton, who holds a camera in a certain way, focuses on certain things at a certain time. The movement of that camera is going to be so fundamental to the sensation that we will have when we look at the image. And then looking at these images filmed by Claire Maton with the editor I have worked with for several films, Claire Atherton, in trying to understand what these images actually tell us, regardless of what we intended for them to do, and how do we structure a temporality around them. And then working with the curator, how do we put this inside a space? What does it mean to show it in a certain way? What do we put on the walls around this work to try to create other dialogues? And this is endlessly interesting, and it's also immensely collaborative. In other words, I think that I work individually in the sense that I'm not part of a collective, but all of the work is collective. All of the work is endlessly, is absolutely the result of what we have done together to think through this mess to make another mess.
Yet it's within your remit to hold the space. Is that?
The agreement is that I hold the space. Is that what you mean? Why at some point somebody has to take responsibility, because the reason why I continue to work as an individual artist mostly collaboratively is that at some point you have to say, I'm responsible for what this is, and I'm accountable for what this is. And I've worked with many people who have helped me build this, but I have to take responsibility for what it is, for having decided that it would not be certain things and that it is certain things. And so typically, to be very specific about the film that we talked about already, Letters to Max, it's a film about a split narrative. The Georgian narrative is radically different than the Abkhaz narrative about the results of this civil war that Abkhazia won with the help of Russia. I chose to make a film with one voice, the voice of a single person who, as you just said, was a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Abkhazia. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is responsible for, broadcasting a national narrative into the airwaves of diplomatic channels and media channels around the world. So I've given him the monopoly of the space of speech inside of this film. But at the same time, I can't possibly make a film that pretends that there is no other narrative. But I've refuted over the years this idea that, you know, you create fairness through the presentation of two opposing narratives. You know, today the mantra of news is supposedly that you could create objectivity by presenting for an equal number of minutes contrasting narratives. You have your Republicans and your Democrats, you have your Israelis and you have your Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. And then somewhere along the way, you wheel out the expert, you know, who's generally bald and who has a, you know, a university degree and who sort of arbitrates or helps us, educate us on this. And that's how you would create objectivity. And I think what's wonderful about the mess that art proposes is that it's a radically different idea. That so I'm not going to create an objective tale of what happened in Abkhazia as a result of the civil war, but I can't give sort of a monopoly of space to one narrative. So I create a film that has one voice, but the presence of other narratives, other ways, through the images that I use, through the images of empty houses that have been abandoned because the Georgians who live there have been ethnically cleansed, or if you want to say it in a different way, have fled the conflict and not been allowed to return, and to try to create in the film all of these spaces that evidently pose enormous questions about the narrative that Max holds in the film. And so the role of the spectator here is maybe we are hearing a single narrative from Max, but the film is responsible for showing how fragile or problematic this narrative is, to show these possibilities of absent narratives that would contradict Max's, that is to even have Max go out on a limb and say things sometimes that are very beautiful, like what you pointed out about how war is easy because you know what you have to do, and that the aftermath of the war is the difficult part, but also to have Max, who's a very, you know, pleasant and charismatic and joyful character, say very, you know, horrible things, like saying that he believes that the Georgians should not have the right to return. What does it mean to hear Max say this after we've spent a good part of the film liking Max? And these are the kinds of things that I'm responsible for, that, you know, that might mean that the film may be considered inadequate by some people, but also I think it creates a film where there's space for the viewer to think about all of these problems, to think about multiplicity of narratives, missing narratives, problematic narratives, and to start sort of inhabiting this space rather than just being told what to think, or worse, being told that somehow this film holds some kind of objectivity, which it does not. So that's what I meant when I said that there's something about the responsibility of making the decisions that and associating your name with the form, and you're responsible for these choices.
It sounds as if also there is a responsibility in creating a void space, an ambiguity. So if you did become very explicit about your point of view, that would also be a real problem, perhaps, with the work.
Well, also, that assumes that I would have a clarity in my point of view, which I don't have. But absolutely, void. And the word you used is void and ambiguity. And I think these are absolutely the spaces of art, you know, and so many other media, void and ambiguity have created the intensity of the work, whether it's, you know, an empty canvas by Malevich or you know, a monochrome canvas or an ambiguously colorful canvas in the case of, I don't know, a Rothko, et cetera. There is an enormous amount of intensity that can come from ambiguity and void, and I think that's resolutely part of the palette that makes art endlessly interesting and exciting, and possibly, you know, explains many ways why it was necessary for me to migrate outside of social sciences that fear void and ambiguity for very understandable reasons.
I think it's interesting that it's something that requires labor in art is not, and in your work, it seems to me, it's not something that's just there and then you're like, okay, I've got, but it's actually, it's the thing, the very thing that's being built.
I think I love the idea that work includes labor, you know? I think Chantal Akerman used to say that the duration of her films should be a physical sensation, which implies that, you know, possibly boredom is not a pleasant sensation, but it's a sensation that is very fertile in what it can fabricate. And I like the idea that labor, that work can be, you know, if it's called work in the first place, then the notions of labor shouldn't be that, you know, foreign to it. Not just the labor of the person who made the work, but maybe the labor of the person who's viewing the work.
I think we've kind of explored this, but I'm thinking of the Un Film Dramatique, and maybe the first time I saw it, I just watched it. But then maybe the second time in preparation for this conversation, I was thinking about you, because I was going to be speaking to you. And I was constantly thinking, where are you here? And I think we have, in a sense, explored your role in your own work and you being in charge, etc. It's an interesting example, or it's an example of a certain ambiguity in terms of your role. And I just wonder how you approach yourself within that work.
I mean, it's a huge question. It's always been a huge question and a very interesting question for me, because on the one hand, maybe it's, you know, a part of my personality that has guided me. I'm not present in the work the way, say, a Jean-Luc Godard is present, because his voice or even his image is inside of the material itself, or a Werner Herzog whose place is explicitly, you know, etched inside of the image, and that these are the perspectives from which, you know, they worked, or Agnès Varda, who's a character inside of the film, or Chantal Akerman, whose voice or whose biographical sort of urgency is anchored inside of the work, and the list could go on. But at the same time, I'm also, you know, not Frederick Wiseman either, who's sort of observing in immersion and trying to be as invisible as possible, even though he will never be invisible, because we know he's in the space and he's carrying, you know, the mic or the camera. Eric, the character of Eric, is present in these films, either as the person who is writing the letters to Max, asking the questions, or in the case of my very first film, writing the emails and interviewing Masao Adachi, who is talking about the deal that we are making to construct this film, you know, the negotiation that we have about under what conditions will he tell me his story and what he wants in exchange from me. And because he's speaking from the perspective of a former terrorist, and that I am negotiating with the former terrorist, and we all know that we should not negotiate with terrorists, this role of me in the object has always been a very big part of making this work. And in fact, because one of the first times when it became a true subject for me was with this first film, the Anabasis of Mei and Fusako, Shigenobu, and Masao Adachi, because Adachi said, I'll tell you my story, but I want you to do something for me. I want you to, because he could no longer travel, he was forbidden from traveling outside of Japan. He said, I'll talk to you, but I would like you to film these things for me in Beirut and give me these images. And I remember at the time thinking, this is fantastic. This is amazing. He's handing me a key to what would become a very important thing in my filmmaking later on, which is to bring to the surface of the work the nature of the negotiation that the work is the result of. In other words, and this is a gift that he gives me because it solves so many things, because I'm not comfortable being Werner Herzog or being Godard and being in the work, but yet I'm very interested in the work reflecting the negotiation that this work is between an author and a subject. And so since Masao Adachi's first email, which became part of the film, most of the films have included pointers, elements that suggest the nature of this relationship that creates the film. And so in un film dramatique, because I'm not writing letters to the characters, but I'm spending 4 years of my life with them, I exist in the film through moments when the students talk to me or talk about me or say that I like certain things. And of course, you can imagine that a lot of this is something that we end up deciding upon in the editing room, how much of Eric is inside of the film. If there's not enough Eric inside of the film, because, you know, part of my modesty would be very content to just not be too present in the film, but it would be very dishonest because the film was very much made with me. And so how, you know, it's like cooking, how much of this ingredient that we will call Eric do you put in the recipe, so that the spectator is regularly confronted with this notion that I'm present, that I'm in the room with the kids, that I am the adult in the room, so that there's a structural, you know, sort of relationship here that we can't ignore. So part of formalizing the mess is also formalizing the amount of presence of the author inside of the fabrication of the narrative, without putting too much, because then it becomes harder to digest, but not too little, so that we, you know, so it's like these tools of distanciation, or like in Brecht, you know, having something about the form remind us at regular intervals that there is no, you know, third wall, or I forget how it's said, or that you know, reminding us of the structure, so that again the spectator is put back in this place of thinking about the space in which we are, and who's responsible for it, and who's inside this space, and what are some of the power dynamics among, you know, the humans inside this space. And that is answering the question of where am I in the work.
And when you are there, are you a director, a film director, or are you a friend, or are you a teacher?
Well, you know, there's many words that can be used, you know. In English, we say director, which means I direct, which is a very sort of replicates the authoritarian nature of film, which it is. It's a, you know, it's a pyramid structure, and the director's up top telling people what to do. So this is not my favorite word, because I think it doesn't necessarily, it's not kind to the notion of collaboration and sharing and inventivity that occurs outside of the direction of this sort of, you know, authority. So I don't love the word director. In French, sometimes we say mise en scène, or metteur ou metteuse en scène, which means the person who puts onto the stage. And I find this to be a very interesting concept, because it means it's the person who literally puts onto the stage, but then what happens on the stage could easily escape from the direction, you know? A mise en scène is somebody who creates the circumstances in which something is going to unfold, but what unfolds could be beyond the grasp or the invention of the metteur en scène.
Or even the ability of camera to capture it. So it could go off
exactly.
the screen and come back.
Sure, exactly. You know, I circumvent the issue by generally putting in the credits a film by Éric Baudelaire. That makes it very simple. I sign it in the same way that I'll scribble my name in the bottom of an etching, or at the, you know, on the back of a photograph. So it's a way of just saying, I take ownership of this, but it's a bit fuzzy about sort of who done what. Of course, what I do like about film is credits, you know, as opposed to artworks that generally don't come with a credit sequence. I take a lot of care of the credit sequence. I think it's a really beautiful thing to make with a graphic designer. In this case, it's most often Pierre-François Letuet, or before that it was Jean-Marie Courant. But we think a lot about the typography, the speed, the way in which the images, the names appear on screen, and what words are put next to the names. Like the credit sequence of Un film dramatique is enormously long. It's 5 full minutes, which is way too long, because, you know, when we do screenings and film festivals, the credits are so long that people end up leaving the room. And then when we have the Q&A at the end of the screening. A lot of people have left because they didn't want to sit through 5 minutes worth of credits. But the reason why there are 5 minutes worth of credits, we could have done it a lot faster, but it was very complicated to unpack who did what in a film dramatique, whose images did we look at, whose ideas was this film made with, who participated and was on camera and was on screen, and how did we, organize our sessions. And this took me 5 minutes to figure out. But I think the credit sequence is tremendously interesting. I think there's a Godard film that opens with the opening credits is just a checkbook and a pen putting the name of the different people in the crew and signing a check, and then the check gets ripped out, and so he's Godard is saying this is labor, and it's a transaction, and this transaction is financial, and that's how the film opens as a credit sequence. There's another credit sequence which is beautiful, where I think it's during the Dziga Vertov period, where the films are signed in a way that's very atypical today. It says produit par, so produced by Jean-Luc Godard and Anne-Marie Mieville, just typically using the word producer, which is not necessarily a word that we would associate with making the film in today's cinema language. But I think he liked it because you produce goods and services, you produce that was the title that he gave to himself and to Anne-Marie Mieville. And then it said réalisé par, which is realized by, which is usually where the art house filmmaker puts their name. And here, under this category, are all the technicians and everybody else who worked on the film. And so in this case, what Godard is telling us is, no, this film was produced by me and Anne-Marie Mieville, and it was realized by all these other people because they actually fabricated the film. And so I like this tradition of artists who are thinking through the credit sequence. And that's one of the great pleasures of making films, is that you can make the credit sequence at the beginning and at the end a part of the work, rather than a wall text. And contemporary art is fascinated and obsessed with the idea of the solitary artist working on their own and evacuating the names of everybody else in the room. Luckily, film isn't like this.
I mean, there is so much spontaneity in your film, and it's actually even in some works that are not filmic.
I mean, so much of what I do is connected to who do you put in the room? How did you prepare this sequence? How did you prepare, assign roles, stimulate ideas or desires, place the people together in a space, and then how do you record or keep a trace of what has happened? That's a huge part of making the work. Sometimes it's just like, writing 1,000 letters to parliamentarians, putting the right name on the envelope, sending it, to Parliament, and then waiting for a few weeks before people respond. But you're basically putting things into motion, and then trying, hopefully collecting something in return, which can become an artwork.
I mean, in some way, what you're doing, you're also asking questions. I guess what you do there, you are asking questions in that work, where you send letters to British parliamentarians, but you never know what the answer will be, whether it will be a very kind of witty answer, or whether it will be like a kind of bureaucratic explanation. How do you think about questions that you ask? And in a way, you're asking a single question in the work to British parliamentarians. But I wonder, how do you generally ask questions in your work? I mean, that is a part of space and setup that you're creating. But then what I'm doing here, I'm not necessarily going through the list of my questions, but I'm responding and building on things that you say in response to my questions. So there's something in the sort of art of just conversing.
Right, absolutely. I love the idea that there's an art to interviewing. I think it's a wonderful form. And I love to listen to podcasts of very great interviewers like Terry Gross on American Public Radio. I find it very interesting that some people have a better ability than others at helping people give birth to a story or a narrative. And I think I love the idea of questions. And I use them, I think, in two different ways. Either there's questions, there's a first round of using questions as a way of very simply informing myself and understanding the situation. And that's, me asking questions to history, or asking questions to a teacher at university, or asking questions when I interview somebody without a recorder or any device, just to be less ignorant about situations. And therefore it's just feeding me, And then there's the question as a device of artistic creation, which means formulating the question in a way that will produce a form or material for me to use in a work. And so the way the phrasing of the question, the sequence of the questions, which one comes before the other is tremendously important. And whether it's, how do I phrase the question that I send to 1,000 British parliamentarians, or how do I phrase the very long letter that I sent to former British prime ministers in an earlier work, this is a painstaking process that generates an answer, and this answer becomes the work, or rather the dialogue between the question and the answer becomes the work. Letters to Max is, I think, 75 letters that I sent to Max over the course of a year, but a huge part of the work is the order of these letters. The questions that I asked in the letters, they have to be short enough to not be cumbersome. They have to be long enough, or rather precise enough, to generate interesting answers. And then there's a sequence. The sequencing of these questions often is like writing a script. If I'm interviewing Alvin Curran or Masao Adachi or Mei Shigenobu, the preparation of these interview sessions is paramount, because the way in which I will ask the questions that are often and almost always removed from the edit, when we hear the film or when we watch the film, we don't hear the questions, we just hear the answers. So the way in which these questions have been asked and the order in which they have been asked is probably the most important thing that I do as an artist. And so, that's, we were talking about this idea of research before. You could simply say that the point of the research is that it needs to prepare me to ask the question in the right form and in the right sequence to produce material that will then become the work. That's really all I do.
But you're still not guaranteed the material that you think you need.
Absolutely.
Right.
But, empirically, I have not abandoned many projects. And I don't mean this as like a prowess or like a bragging point. It means that oftentimes the intuition is that, you find very good storytellers. Also, this is very important. Masao Adachi is an exceptional storyteller. And in fact, he gives me many of the elements that are going to make the film, not just in his story, but he gives me the structural ideas that will be helpful inside of the film. Mei Shigenobu is an amazing storyteller. Alvin Curran has just a wonderful rhythm and manner of telling his own life, and British parliamentarians are very generous storytellers. I don't think it would work if I had written to French parliamentarians. They just would have told me to shove off, and they don't have time. So it's about choosing to work with great storytellers also. And then I have abandoned some projects, but sometimes in good ways. Like this most recent work on parapsychology and telekinesis was initially intended to be a film about and with my mother, and I interviewed her at great lengths, and it didn't work. The interview wasn't the right form. I was not able. I'll let the psychoanalysts, delve into this problem of why I wasn't able to produce a good interview of my mother. But what it resulted in is that we weren't able to make a film with her voice, but the drawings relating to this work appeared in the film about chants and Alvin Curran's music. And then I ended up making a work which is not a film, but that reproduces the experiments in parapsychology that my mom was involved with in the 70s and 80s. And the work becomes a sort of a space where people come to the exhibition and participate in experiments, and it produces drawings, and there's no film. But I think it's a better work than if I had successfully made a film about my mother. So there's been very little sort of like completely wasted projects, but there have been a few, and I think that's also quite good, that it isn't that not everything becomes a successful piece. I think is also kind of lovely.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Barbara Wien, your gallerist in Berlin, is actually has this kind of acute awareness of interview, language, book, like printing. I just find it so fitting, that relationship.
And it's very precious, and it's very rare, and I'm afraid that it's also not the zeitgeist of the future. And the sense that, like, I think what, Barbara is very similar to me in many ways, and they are very similar to Barbara, and that I think we arrive into this world of contemporary art because we are curious, and that we, trust language and interrogation, and asking questions as facilitating the transmission of the things that we love about art, and that we also accept complexity as like a great form of artistic experience. But this is not where we're going. The art fair. Well, let's just say that the art fair is not the privileged space for this kind of activity, and so much of the economy of the commercial nature of the art world has transitioned from the gallery, where you can spend time. You go to a show, you are, surrounded by a number of works from the same artist, and you're having an experience. And we have moved, I would imagine, maybe 90%, or I don't know, but a large percentage of the commercial viability of the art world into these spaces that are like supermarkets, where you spend zero time, and you just sort of like, people, collectors just sort of run around like, headless chicken, and trying to make sure that they've made the right, commercial decision on work that they don't spend any time with. And nobody has time to explain anything. And the largest thing that it produces is carbon emissions, and doesn't really produce, a lot of discourse and a lot of discussion, and I don't think it produces really important aesthetic experiences either. So again, there's some structural.
But so you're quite lucky in a sense to have that relationship with a commercial gallery, someone who values or has values that you share. But then what's your relationship like with, let's say, institutions?
Well, I think what's amazing about institutions is that is the possibility of making large statements in large spaces, and to be exposed to large audiences, and to a history and a collection and a certain relationship to time, to a public that comes and will spend time in these spaces. One of the strangest things about my practice, you could say, is that it has largely been about converting white cubes into experimental cinemas, at a time when the traditional distribution spaces for cinema have been closed to experimental practices. In other words, if you look at what was playing in movie theaters in the 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, amazing works were being shown in dark spaces, and people were buying tickets. 1 million French people bought tickets to go see Alain René's film, Hiroshima, Mon Amour. 1 million spectators at the time. The same film, you would not get commercial distribution. Nobody would show that film. Or it would show for 1 week in 2 art house movie theaters, and then it would be shut down. And then it would have sold, 600 tickets. So the point is that
you said that American and European cinematic cultures are different. Yeah.
True. But they're under threat everywhere,
yes,
so to speak. But again, the point is, and I'm not complaining. I'm just actually very relieved by the fact that, it's been possible for me to migrate the forms from one space to another. And museums, because that was your question, institutions have been very, very welcoming of this. And so, un film dramatique shown for 3 months at the Centre Pompidou is 50,000 visitors. The same film shown on television, which it was 30,000 visitors. The same film possibly shown in cinemas, which was never offered to me as a possibility, would have been a few thousand visitors. And so to me, it's been, about finding different spaces that can host these forms, these hybrid forms, these sort of, open-ended forms that are not the product of industrial cinema and industrial distribution channels, and finding spaces of freedom, liberty, encounter with the audience, very generous spaces inside of the institution. So this has been extremely important for me. And I find that institutions are today producing immensely interesting discursive spaces. If you look at the public programs being held at the Centre Pompidou today, it's amazing how many incredible talks, discussions, retrospectives with screenings are being held there. So these are very, very precious places. And I hope that we are able to understand as a society how important it is to preserve them and to not let them all disappear from the public sector to the private sector, which is, a huge problem in France right now. Museums are struggling, and private foundations are of course, sort of
flourishing,
flourishing, and they are doing good shows, but then it's not the same. It's not the same thing. It's not the same agenda. It's not the same sort of public service. And so this is, of course, a subject of concern.
Yet the public institutions have certain responsibilities. I guess having your film dramatique at the public institution is exactly what we should see in a public institution. But in some sense, these are still places that need to be challenged, their intentions or their, I guess, questioned or...
Right. And I think you're absolutely right. And we need to continue in the great tradition of institutional critique, because there's even a name of a current in art history that, that proposes specifically to be critical of institutions. And I think today we're doing there's a lot of really good work done about, sort of confronting the colonial histories of institutions, and a lot of work being done sort of, looking very unkindly at the amount of prejudice and exclusion that is visible in the collections of institutions, and trying to create, a little bit less inequality. That being said, I still think that these are spaces of great liberty. And, un film dramatique has been well received by many institutions, and has usually been shown extremely well, not always. This is something I still have to fight for. 2 museums in Germany have acquired the work. One of them did an exemplary work at how they displayed the work, how they involved the children, how they showed the work in the spirit of how the work was made, in all of its social dimensions, and invited young students from schools with large immigrant student bodies, interact with the film, and produce drawings that were shown in the museum, et cetera, et cetera. And another museum not very far away that sort of put this on the wall, didn't involve me, didn't involve the kids. And, you know, despite my protesting, didn't really seem to care. And so, you know, there are as many different kinds of institutions as there are wills and different understanding of what makes a great show, and how and what sort of human and social values need to be important in the making of the show. Because there is the work, and there's good work and bad work, but there's also good ways to show work and bad ways to show work. And all of these are part of the weight that we have to carry as artists, is that you have to negotiate all these different moments. You have to negotiate the making of the work. You have to negotiate the selling or transmission of the work so that it exists elsewhere and that you can make a living. And then you have to negotiate the afterlife of the work when you're no longer when it's no longer in your possession. And the power dynamics are very complicated to navigate, because of course these are all very difficult, you know, economic transactions, and when the work escapes you, technically it is no longer yours, and it's very complicated to ensure that the way in which you wanted it to be put into the world is respected. Sometimes there's cost considerations. Institutions will tell you, well, that's all wonderful, but we don't have the money to do that. And so then you have to negotiate all these other very difficult questions, which is, you know, is it more important that the work circulate, or that it's more important that the work circulate and be shown exactly in the way I wanted it to circulate? And, you know, the art history is full of wonderful works that came with instructions that are so complex to fulfill that the work cannot be shown. But at the same time, you also have to be willing to fight a little bit so that the work is at least shown in a way that is minimally acceptable to the spirit of how the work was made, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these negotiations are an enormous part of what we do, and they're very, very exhausting and time consuming.
Well, it sounds like they're the artwork in their own right, maybe.
There's certainly work.
Be.
I don't know. I mean, you could, you know, there's a really great book by Miriam Khan, the painter, that is just her emails and her letters with institutions. It's the whole book. And I think this is really great because, you know, I love her as a painter, and I also love her as somebody who has just, you know, she's hardcore. She's the manner in which, you know, the way she conducts negotiations with institutions is full of radical integrity. And so to produce this book, which is just like the looking, you know, how the cooking is done, but in its nastiest way, I think is kind of brilliant.